Mr. Turner, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship and to be back in Parliament for these very important Westminster Hall debates. And if I can congratulate the member for Glasgow North on what I thought was an excellent opening speech that has set the tone for the rest of the debate. And if you'll permit me to, for the first time, offer my extended congratulations to the member for Welwyn Hatfield and welcome him to his role. He will already know in the short time that he's been in the department that it's a fantastic department to work in and alongside tackling many of those issues. I have to say we do already share something in common, which is a very similar name. And I've learnt this over my 5 years in Parliament up until now, because the postman here doesn't always deliver with 100% accuracy. And I have to say I had noticed that the minister's invites were printed on considerably thicker card than mine very often. So I hope that now that we're shadowing one another in this position, perhaps we'll tackle inequality in that way as well. Mr. Turner, we live in a global society, yet every 10 seconds a child dies from hunger and malnutrition. And nearly 1 billion people, even after the Millennium Development Goals come to an end this year, are still living in extreme poverty. Hundreds of thousands of women die each year during pregnancy and childbirth, and a population more than 3 times the size of Birmingham dies each year just purely from water-related diseases. To stand aside and to allow this to continue when we may take action is to perpetuate a great injustice. Ours is the generation that could see the end to extreme poverty, to reduce inequality and tackle climate change. But it would be easy in the current climate to turn away from tackling some of the world's most intractable problems. The thread that connects the key issues that we face of climate change, of economic crises, of disease and conflict is their global and interdependent nature. 2015 is a unique opportunity for the world to see a realignment and a new settlement of institutions and shared action that can tackle these threats. So in this context, the focus of today's debate on the agreement to be secured in September as the replacement of the Millennium Development Goals is just one of 2 crucial summits that will take place this year. As we know and as members have already referred to, in December in Paris we'll also hopefully agree a framework to tackle climate change into the next generation. Now, we stood on a manifesto that promised to prioritise these global accords and these twin and related accords. We're determined to hold the government to account through this Parliament to ensure that Britain's reputation as a leader in international development, a reputation which was hard fought and hard won by the last Labour government, continues to endure. And there have been some valuable contributions from today's debate. The member for Liverpool West Derby, in his comments about inequality, went right to the heart of what our focus, I believe, needs to be in the coming months. The member for Sleaford and North Hykeham, of course, made a powerful contribution, and some of his most interesting comments were actually around the disconnect between the 17 goals and I believe 169 odd targets that are currently in place in the zero draft, and the desire that we would all seek to find that these goals should be clearly explained, and perhaps that probably means having fewer. The member for Central Ayrshire as well, in talking about her own experiences, brought home the powerful nature of going and actually being confronted by the reality of extreme poverty, inequality, but also the hope that many communities have, not just for themselves and their own lives, but for their whole communities, and what we can do to empower those people. And of course the member for Innismore, in his talking about cooperation, not just at a UK level, which I believe passionately in, I have to say, but also the experiences we can garner from devolved administrations, such as the government in Wales, which I know from my own experience has been hugely inspiring in terms of tackling these issues at a community level as well. There are also some specific concerns that have been raised, Mr. Turner. I might just go through one after the other. Now, we've talked about the ways in which the SDGs are not just there to eradicate extreme poverty, but to tackle growing inequality as well. And we would put in a particular emphasis on this, and did indeed in our manifesto. Gender, caste, race, community, disability, religion, age and ethnicity are all too often what determine your life chances. Health, education, jobs and participation are increasingly determined at birth. And so we promise to prioritise human rights, climate change and universal healthcare in a bid to tackle this growing concern. Now, health inequality can be one of the most debilitating inequalities that someone can experience. As the part of the NHS, we talked about how we wanted everyone to enjoy the protections that we in this country take for granted. And we committed to providing global partnership, support and encouragement needed to countries that want to provide healthcare for their own citizens. So it's very welcome, actually, just 2 weeks ago, over the dispatch box, to hear the Secretary of State stating that you have advocated very strongly for universal health coverage that truly makes a difference to people and puts them in a position to be able to play a role in helping to develop their country. Particularly welcome, I might just add, because it stood in stark contrast to the previous Secretary of State, who also happens to be the current Secretary of State, who failed to make the provision of universal health coverage in the post-2015 agenda prior to the election and refused to support a standalone goal on universal healthcare coverage. And I might just add, actually, most devastatingly of all, cut in her own department the direct support to health systems on a year-by-year basis, which allowed and created the conditions in which Ebola went unchecked for too long. So be grateful for the Minister to outline what steps the UK government will take in light of their new position around the crucial agenda of universal healthcare, with particular regard as to whether or not universal healthcare in the language of the goal around healthcare is something that the government would now support and push for in the room in September. Now, I also spoke last week in the Chamber about how climate change will be seen as development in reverse, how rising sea levels, droughts and storms are all confronting the world's poorest. When your very survival is under threat from natural disasters, from thriving diseases and conflict over resources, economic development can often become a romantic ideal. Despite these clear links, I remain concerned that the zero draft outcome document remains unambitious on this agenda, allowing Goal 13 to essentially remain a holding text for an agreement that has not yet happened and whose start date and implementation remains 5 years from now. That's why in September I've urged the Secretary of State and urged the Minister today to ensure that climate change remains a standalone goal in the post-2015 SDGs, with the language of a 2% global temperature rise embedded in the language of the goal. Now, this may seem dry, but actually the lesson of the Millennium Development Goals was that the language was hugely important for focusing minds and for measuring progress. So I wonder if the Minister might be able to say a few words on that issue as well. But this debate is more than just about the negotiation of the language on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's also, and needs to be, about their implementation. We would particularly welcome the opportunity to hear what the new government sees as its priorities within this expansive agenda. And as the member opposite alluded to, 17 goals and 169 targets may be difficult to galvanise political will around. So whether or not this, the UK government's position is to see fewer goals and greater focus on those, and if so, what those goals would be. There are questions about this government's leadership, I might just add as well, global leadership. And certainly when the Prime Minister was appointed as the co-chair to the high-level panel process, we were disappointed to see that he only actually attended half those meetings. In that context, we would like to hear exactly how the Prime Minister means to go about his negotiating process with regard to the SDGs, especially when key issues such as climate change have fallen off the agenda in meetings that he's chaired in the past, and it actually took Germany's Chancellor to put climate back on the agenda in the most recent G7 discussions. The all-embracing nature of the zero draft could risk prevarication and duplicity, potentially enabling governments to selectively address those goals and targets most aligned to their existing agenda, and failing to challenge the more complex and formidable and interconnected issues that we face. I will give way.
I wonder whether he also agrees that there is this difficulty, that unless there is effective monitoring, you may get within regions and indeed within countries areas where the Sustainable Development Goals are properly implemented or efforts are made to do that, but there are rural areas in particular in the developing world which simply get left behind because everybody is concentrating on the capital cities.
I completely agree with his well-put point, and also would just add that one of the challenges that we will have to face in our generation, which those that negotiate the first Millennium Development Goals, is of increasing urbanisation, potentially leaving a group of people even further disconnected. And an issue such as universal healthcare, the issue there becomes obvious. How do you have a healthcare system that reaches out right across all different communities? So monitoring will be key, which is why we've called for disaggregation of data within the results that come forward through this process. So, Mr. Turner, we believe that we've been clear about our priorities, and we would ask the government to be equally clear in its negotiating position in tackling inequality, in ensuring the attainment of human rights, including those fundamental rights of women and girls that remain at the heart of these agreements, and in combating climate change, not just now, but into Paris in December. I hope that the Minister will be willing to match our ambitions in this field.